There's an article I haven't been able to stop thinking about for the last few months. Ben Lehnert, a fellow at Princeton, sent it to me, and today we unpack what's in that article, why it's so interesting, and what it means for all of us. I'm Andrew Hogan, head of insights at Figma, and this is Fig Brew. Okay, Ben, so you shared an article with me that I haven't been able to stop thinking about over the last few months. We've had some email exchanges. It is by Arvind Narayan, and it's called AI as Normal Technology. We'll pull it up on the screen. You can kind of see it. It's a little long, so we're not going to read the whole thing together here. What is the central idea, Ben, of this article that you shared with me?
Yeah, great question. And honestly, for me, it's been the same, which is why I've been sharing it with folks that I've been exchanging ideas with and discussing this, because when I first read it, and it came out at this point, I want to say probably 6 months ago, I think it was such a counterbalance in a lot of ways I found very refreshing to the very, I guess, mostly Silicon Valley dominated narrative around AI as this impending super intelligence that will take over everything, and we're basically already in the middle of it, and it's going to go very quickly. And then there was the 2030 paper or 2027 paper that was published that kind of just perpetuated that. And so when this paper came out, which, as you mentioned, was written by Professor Arvind Narayan at Princeton with his co-author Sayash Kapoor, it, I think, put all of that in a I would say more measured context. And the core idea is basically that AI is a very powerful technology. It's actually a set of technologies, which is also part of, I think, the problem and misunderstanding. It's a set of technologies, is a general purpose technology, and as such, it will follow pretty predictable phases of overall mass adoption across society. But that adoption will go much slower than these other papers have suggested. We're talking in measurement of decades rather than years. And so I thought that was really interesting.
And what are some of the other general purpose technologies? It's like electricity.
Steam engine, electricity. Maybe you could probably even the printing press could be considered one as well. But are these technologies that have really had a broad applicability eventually across most of our lives?
Right. Electricity is pretty important for recording this right
Correct.
now. It's playing a key role. And that wasn't really why it was invented, but it's playing a key role.
Yes.
But yeah, the electrification of, I think, like the United States took 100 years or something like that?
Yeah. And one of the examples that they're mentioning, for example, is that I think it took about 40 years from the invention of electricity to a dynamo being installed, in like factories, for example. So we will probably have faster, adoption of this new general purpose technology AI, simply because the world is more connected and we've advanced as a society, as a species, scientifically. But overall, we're talking in measurements of decades rather than years. And there's a lot of road bumps that will come along the way in various forms, which they also lay out very clearly in the paper. I think that for me personally, that was a moment where I could just take a deep breath. And I think it gives us a chance to, rather than just continuously be on a hamster wheel, take a step back and say, okay, well, if that is something that seemingly is true, there's a lot of historic parallels, then what can we do with this understanding?
Yeah. The one that stuck with me was the idea of the factory being reorganized instead of around a central form of power. You had to sort of put them at the stations. Yes. In order to get the big benefit from. Anyway, it's just a number of really interesting things, and it had the same effect for me. There's a torrent of information, and it essentially contextualized what we are seeing in a way that, while it could be fast, there's a distinct difference between, something impending superintelligence and something that might change our lives over a period of time and change different parts of our lives over a period of time.
Yeah, and it's also probably worth noting that, as I mentioned earlier, part of the clarity that the article brings is also this understanding of what even is AI, right? The two co-authors of the paper have published a book before this. It was called AI Snake Oil, which does a really good job explaining how we've all been using and subject to various AI technologies over the last decade or two already. We just have not been interacting directly often with it, or not with these newer parts like LLMs, or even generative image generation or video generation, all of that sort, which is a newer part of AI.
I mean, it sort of gets all put under this umbrella term, and many of us have algorithmic feeds.
Yes.
And use them frequently. Right around the time of the mother of all demos, where the mouse was demoed, and the idea of video conferencing and all these other things, it's like the 50s. The joke was, well, why is he working on this instead of on artificial intelligence? Because clearly that's the future, and that's 70 years ago.
Exactly.
So this is a topic, a term that's been around for a while, obviously transformative and interesting, and the paper is an interesting contextualization of that.
Yes.
Why are we talking about this on a show that's connected to design?
Yeah.
What does this have to do with design? And Ben, you've got some really interesting historical parallels that you shared with me, and I just think people would be interested in those. So why don't you run us through a couple?
Yeah. One of the big thoughts that this paper triggered in me as a designer, former design executive, someone who now works with a lot of different companies and also in the academic space that I'm in, that the paper, and you and I talked about this over email, the paper lays out this overall framework, diffusion framework of general purpose technology. So it basically starts with innovation. Invention. We invent a new technology, then innovation, meaning we start to apply some of that new invention to certain use cases or some early ideas of how this could become useful. But between that and actual adoption, mass adoption, is a long period of time of all sorts of roadblocks that we have to go through and this and that, until we reach that last stage of diffusion, meaning the technology is now applied in a lot of different ways and available to human beings and society in a multitude of ways that hopefully make our lives better, sometimes even can be misused. But overall, that is all part of the adoption diffusion. When I was reading through the paper, one of the things that popped into my mind, and maybe that's also because there's a lot of parallels drawn to the Industrial Revolution, which, electrification plays a large role in that, and the industrial design was, well, it sort of implies along this entire phasing from, invention all the way to diffusion, design plays a large and big role here. And so that got me down a rabbit hole of exploring if that thought and idea was in the first place really valid or not. And I was starting to dig into, industrial revolution, industrialization, and I found, I think, a good amount of examples. It still is holding true. So I'll give you a few. Starting with the steam engine and locomotive design, so trains, right? There's the technical concept of the train, and then there's the design of the train. And one of the things I came across was that there was this streamlined locomotive movement in the early 1930s. And I think probably once people look them up, these locomotives are very well known. We all know the design. Like it's a Polar Express, maybe even more futuristic.
Sort of, right. It is. That's true.
Yeah.
It's actually like the iconic train. When you think of a train,
Yes.
you probably think of this, even though none of the trains today look like this.
Exactly. And so what you find is that the Streamline company actually hired this very famous industrial designer, Raymond Loewy, and a bunch of others to design these trains. And they have this streamlined, aerodynamic looking design. But what turns out to be the case is that design had zero impact on the aerodynamics, the fuel consumption, or the speed of the train at all. In fact, because the trains were moving at such slow speeds that from a physics perspective, it just didn't make a difference aerodynamically. What the design did was that it kind of ushered in this idea and this era of train traveling. It became part of this narrative, this cultural narrative of accepting the train, accepting train travel, and everything that came, especially in the US, with this idea of prosperity and being, mobile as a society. So I found that really fascinating. So that was one of the first things that I found. And then when you go a little bit through like younger history, you come across Olivetti typewriters, for example. And there too, you find that actually Adriano Olivetti, he hired artists. They designed these really eventually very compact, beautiful, kind of smooth lines typewriters. You could reduce it down to aesthetics, but what I want to get to as we go through some of the other examples that are a little bit more current, the function of design, of industrial design in this context, combined with these general purpose technologies, is that design brings the technology, the functionality, the use case together with a cultural acceptance. It starts shaping also the narrative, the way we make the technology approachable, which is a really big part of getting over some of these roadblocks, because as human beings, we're naturally opposed to change, right? And we need to embed the change into a narrative that we can actually all connect to. So for the typewriter, it became this beautiful device that you could now use to write, and it became part of, at least for a certain group of people, of the device that you wanted to use.
And presumably leave out in your house as well. Like,
correct.
You can display it to other people. It's an object of like desire and interest. And I know one of your other phrases, one of the phrases that you've used before with me, is that it's about making the technology, usable, accepted, and able to change and help behaviors in positive ways.
Yes,
is the goal of the designer. And in these, the train helps to sort of go longer distances, and if people sort of are on board with the idea of being on the train, all of a sudden you can take trips that are much further away. You're okay with moving goods longer distances, which then presumably makes it easier to transport agricultural products or other things.
Yes.
And I just loved some of the way you thought about the role of design in this.
Yeah, I mean, one of the probably the main definition of design that I'm using now is exactly along those lines, is the idea of design being the ability to give shape to an intent in order to influence behavior. And when we're looking at what design does, and this goes from product design, industrial product design, to software design, to service design, it's always taking an intent, often driven by innovation, giving it a shape that eventually influences behavior, hopefully in a good way. But there's also, and I think that comes with the definition, there's also unintended consequences. There's also ways that we shape behaviors that we don't want to necessarily have as outcome. But overall, I think when we're looking at these examples, then that plays a key role, that we want to make sure that these products, based on this new technology, actually become more approachable. And there's a lot of layers to making something approachable. There's an aesthetic layer, obviously, to it, but there's also behavioral layers to this, that we need to get people to embrace new ideas of how to interact with each other, with technology, and so on and so forth.
Sure. And technology, and the big word, to your point, typewriters were profound technology when they were invented. The locomotive, profound technology. So you have the locomotive and the streamlined movement. You have Olivetti and the typewriter. And then obviously we get into computing. I mean,
yes.
Many of us know the next set of stories, but I think it's worth like articulating them out. I have learned many people do not know about MS-DOS and what the interactions were like when you were writing commands, for MS-DOS.
Yes.
It's so interesting to think about, because that, like, I am not that old. This is people are like, wait, describe this to me, and I'm like, yeah. So walk us through that sort of like progression, and what happened there with DOS and with the GUI, and what do you know about that?
Yeah, I have a fascinating story on that note too, when it comes to actually what we're talking about from my time at SAP. But so I think the next big jump, let's say in a general purpose technology that really has changed drastically the way we relate to each other in society, is obviously the personal computer. Computing as a whole, but specifically the personal computer, when it became no longer a massive room that you had to have a computer, but actually probably an example that I've used is productization of the Macintosh. And because what's interesting here is that design really played a key role in making the computer personal, because there were other computers, desktop computers, before the Mac. And even though some of the ideas of the mouse, the graphical user interface, already existed for way longer than, way longer before the Macintosh, it was Apple who brought it together in a package that was approachable. Again, hired an industrial designer to actually come up with this device that could sit on your desk. It was, at the time, really revolutionary industrial design, encased, beautiful. Even the handwritten hello when you would start it up, it all made this very daunting, scary new technology much more approachable. But yes, you're right. Before that, the only way we were able to interact with computers was through black and white screens and, handwritten commands in the DOS or pre-DOS era even. And that was for most people not approachable, right? For the general public, that was not approachable. Even the way Apple started, right? It was all tinkerers. They were all people putting together some hardware pieces, putting them in like a wooden box and called this thing a computer. And it was on the one hand, but when we're thinking back to this framework of, adoption and diffusion, we were way far away from mass market adoption and diffusion of computers being on every desk, in every household, in every office, and so on and so forth. And now we're 50, 60 years down the line. Now that's, a reality, but it goes to show how the Macintosh, took these ideas that existed at Xerox PARC, brought it together in a package that really, the Mac, people often don't remember, it had a handle. It came in a bag. You could take it out and put it on a desk and plug it in, and then it made this handwritten hello introduction to itself, and it had the windows that you could move with the mouse. So none of that black and white text input stuff was there. That was, I think, one of the more current examples. And I think it just goes to show that we've now already covered 2-3 big general purpose technologies, and they always follow the same sort of cycle, and design played a vital role in all of them.
Yeah, I think people, just to point, like, the hello is a huge flex, for lack of a better word, right? If the previous interactions are these really like small typed things, and there's like a blinking cursor, and the text is very like computer, and then all of a sudden this other thing comes out and it says hello in cursive. Like, just, hey, we are using processing power to just make you feel a little more comfortable with what you're about to get into.
And I think that you're pointing at a really good aspect here, and it's the thoughtfulness and the embrace of, there's probably a million ways you could have opened up that initial interaction with the technology. But Apple already at the time, understanding human factors and how to connect emotionally with humans, and what resonates and what doesn't, and what makes then in turn the technology approachable, I think made the difference here. Because getting that cursive to appear on the screen at the time was probably the hardest thing, the hardest version of all the versions you could have come up with. The same way all the iconography was extremely difficult to make, right? They were hand-drawn in a grid of pixels, and then sort of slowly translated into the software. So it just goes to show how the intentional shaping of that experience, based on human factors, based on the understanding that we're shaping behavior, in turn we're shaping culture, that requires a lot of thought, and being very mindful about those steps that you're taking. And also goes to show why certain products and certain companies are more successful than others in driving, the adoption of certain technologies. And I want to be cautious, because it's not just design's success, obviously.
Absolutely. I mean, the designer didn't make the cursive appear like directly.
Right. But it's the approach to developing the product as a whole, the experience as a whole, that does in fact then make the technology work in service of humans and society. And the process and the discipline of design definitely, plays a huge role there.
Well, I mean, we have this saying, design is everyone's business, and
Correct.
A lot of these examples are that. Like,
Yes.
they are not like solely the focus of the designer, and in fact, it's not even clear always who had the idea. Right. It's a group that comes together with their understanding of the situation to come up with some revolutionary thing at the time too, which also, like, that shifts as well. Seeing hello as we have a nostalgia response now. We don't have like a, wow, this is a really approachable computer.
Yes.
It's a different thing, and so they shift over time, and that's one of the things that I think is good to understand is that the sort of taste and craft shifts in relation to the situation.
Yes, and that's why, even in my definition of design, I don't look at design as a department, as a discipline, even per se. Of course, there are certain parts of the craft that we still need to train people. In fact, I think it's more important than ever to get some really good foundations there. But in terms of my definition of giving shape to an intent to influence behavior, that is a team effort of people coming together, understanding the human factors, and then using that as the determining factor in the highest priority order to make decisions. So 100% alignment there. The taste part is interesting because it's such a tricky term, and it has its moment at the moment, but on the one hand it points in the right direction because taste, when you go dig a little bit deeper into the research, it really means whatever the kind of currently ruling class deems to be appropriate or not. And that's tricky and I think probably problematic. But at the same time, it points to you do need to understand the zeitgeist. You do need to understand the neuroaesthetic and the aesthetic factors of the decisions that you make in your product development, your product design. Because the streamlined example is great there. You do shape the narrative. You need to fit into the narrative in order to really move it forward. And so I have a problem with the term, but I think the underlying understanding is actually very important.
That's fair, and it's good context. I do wonder what the brief was for the streamlined movement. Was it just make it look fast? Like, do you think it was that tight?
Question. I couldn't find any of the exact
brief. We should try to dig that up. Let's try to we'll take action item. All right, so Ben, one thing though I want to poke on before we get to the skills and the foundations that you think are really important here.
Yeah.
ChatGPT has, 800 million weekly active users. That's a lot of people. Do you think that and I don't even mean that specific product. You go broader than that. There's already widespread adoption of this.
Yeah.
What is it that you think? I don't know. Missing is the wrong word, but it seems like it's already sort of going in the direction. They're building the handles. There's already an understanding of the zeitgeist. It's just interesting to think about the adoption that has already happened. And maybe it's because there is something really profound about just typing what you're looking for and getting a response.
Yes, there's a lot there. And the paper speaks to some of the usage numbers and actually putting it into perspective. So I don't want to necessarily go into all the details that's out there. But what I will say is that for me, I saw a lot of the kind of press releases and all the numbers that were out there. And certainly from a traction perspective, that's incredibly impressive. In terms of the real life impact, I think it's still very, very small. If I remember correctly, it's somewhere between 0.5 and 3.5% of all work hours are actually consumed by working with AI. Now, obviously this will go up, but I think it just puts into perspective, and there's some good parallels to the PC adoption in the paper as well, that actually shows that the PC adoption seemingly was higher and quicker than the current adoption of things like GPT. Now, on the flip side, though, I will also say that it is impressive to see how quickly people did embrace this technology, specifically, and again, I want to kind of be a bit more nuanced here, specifically LLMs and interacting with GPT. And when GPT first was public preview, it didn't have any of the web search stuff built in. Right now it does. It's a very different kind of use case. I think part of this is really interesting because it goes sort of to the human factors. It is really fascinating, I think, to us as humans that we have now created a technology and an interface to that technology that is our own language. And I think that's interesting from a cognitive perspective. It's also really interesting from an emotional perspective. It's also dangerous for the same reasons because we have, and I actually, not to plug my own podcast here, but
You
I
should
just
plug your
had
podcast. It's a great podcast. Everyone should listen to it.
Appreciate
Poets and
that.
Thinkers, incredible interviews. You could go deeper with Arvind actually on that as well.
Yes,
Anyway,
exactly. There's an episode.
I'll plug it for you.
I appreciate that. I had a conversation on Poets and Thinkers with Joao Sevillano, who is a clinical psychologist, and we specifically talked about how we've created these machines now that really create the illusion that we're talking to a machine, to something that's like us, because it's using our own language. Really fascinating. I think it has a lot to do with the adoption. But now when it comes to the adoption of LLMs, but now when it comes to the diffusion of AI technology as a whole, or even putting LLMs to a good use, we're still at the very early stages of what that looks like. As an example, in a lot of cases, even just interfacing with an LLM and writing things in a box, it's not always the best way to do it, right? That's currently the only solution we have. We have a box in the middle of the screen that we have to type into, and then we're getting something back. The output isn't great often in terms of it's a ton of text to read, right? Then we have to somehow figure out what we do with the text, how do we manipulate it? And then, we started applying some of that technology in other use cases. I mean, you with Figma Make have one of those use cases where it starts to get a little bit more interesting, because now we can have a text input that now translates into other elements that are often graphical elements or even code that now I can start manipulating in different modalities, which I believe is actually going to be the biggest both hurdle and opportunity to go to true multimodality with the help of this technology, and that will drive actual diffusion. So how do we design multimodal experiences with this AI technology that truly feels natural and it fits into our environment? I have, there's plenty of examples we could talk to, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about GPT, LLMs, and kind of where we're at in that very early adoption cycle.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about the, APIs. People aren't using them as much as OpenAI wants, and then OpenAI puts ChatGPT, the interface out there, and then all of a sudden the usage takes off of both the APIs and the original. It's a pretty good example of the design can make a huge difference.
Right.
But I do hear your point of all of a sudden, if you can put images and video and text and speech and all of these other things into that same box, that's a lot for a box to contain. And then if you want to manipulate any individual element of that, and then if you want to take it somewhere else and your output is different and you want to switch between them, that's a lot to design.
Yeah. And, and look, and then on top of that, this is still within a box, right? That we're still within a screen, oftentimes even on our desktop, because, yes, there's a lot of mobile usage too, but we're still within a very confined paradigm. At the same time, right, we're starting to see some of the innovation making into other form factors, right? I've been bullish for a few years now on AirPods. I've also been bullish on AR ever since I got a chance at Microsoft to work on, the HoloLens use cases, even at SAP, like frontline work. So now when we start thinking about how can we apply this technology in other form factors, we can get out of that box. We can think specific use cases, be that in healthcare, frontline workers, even for individual consumer users, like being on the go, not having to look into a screen, and starting to make use of the fact that we can produce human language and interacting with human language back and forth, and all of that. We can auto-generate audio, and then you start to see, I think, how this general purpose technology can really start to diffuse into everyday life.
Sure. The thing, though, that I know from talking to you is that you also don't believe that sort of just happens, and it always happens in the most positive way possible.
Yeah.
And I think you have some thoughts on sort of like the skills, the education movement that might be needed to better sort of harness this in the right way.
Yeah.
And I think that would be interesting for you to share with folks as well.
Yeah, I think, you and I have talked about this, and there too, there's some parallels here that we can look at through history, because as we just extensively talked about, this is not new in terms of big major structural change happening. Starting with the technology, actually, we have now a new general purpose technology that puts us in a similar point in time as when the Industrial Revolution started. And when you look at, for example, the Bauhaus coming, basically being a response to the industrialization and the Industrial Revolution as a school of thought, that
would you elaborate a little bit on it in relation and how it sort of fits in there, because many people may not be as aware of that as they, MS-DOS, same sort of thing.
Totally. So the Bauhaus as a very modern at the time, early in 1920s, 1930s in Germany, in Europe, became this new school of thought and actually practice of design as a response to the Industrial Revolution, essentially. So how do we design products for everyday use? There's also an art component to the Bauhaus, but I'm going to focus specifically on industrial design. In both a way that we can harness this technology and make it useful for society, but also embrace the responsibility that comes with that, right? Because now we were able to mass produce everything, really. Like it was very clear that that's where we're going to head. So there is a responsibility to design thoughtfully for both consumption and production of products that are useful, and the social responsibility. And the Bauhaus as a school, as a university, put together a curriculum that was really interesting in the way it was structured, because it was 3 years and there were 3 rings. And the first ring was a lot of foundational work of, at the time, the material. So you had woodworking and metalwork and color psychology and all of that, understanding the material of the time of the Industrial Revolution to work, within the context of this general purpose technology paradigm shift. And then as you moved outward, it became increasingly more focused on first applying that in systems, and then the system becoming society, and there's some, societal and ethical considerations as well. I actually think we can learn a lot from that. I think we need to think through what are the materials of this, of this general purpose technology. We need to kind of think through, we understanding how these LLMs and systems work. Data, being personal data, generally available data, sensor data, environmental data, all of that coming together. So there's a literacy that needs to be built there. Still, there's a lot of kind of aesthetical skills as well. And then as we kind of move outward, now we need to think about, okay, well, how do we apply these in multimodal use cases? What are these use cases? All the way to, well, now that we can really mass produce software specifically, but we will also soon be able to, 3D print stuff in real time, more or less. How do we deal with the societal and environmental implications, all the way from this stuff is really costly to run. It has a cost on energy, it has a cost on the environment because of that, but it's also potentially can be misused in large scale and at high cost to society. And we need to train people in having an understanding of that as well. So the parallels that I'm trying to draw here is that I see us in a similar place where we will need to rethink not just skills as we used to define them, but really what is the new, you and I talked about, is the kind of human-centered product maker. What does a person look like? Because we're talking about this in the context of Figma Make and other products like it, where you can actually make a piece of software and put it out into the world. And
you might not be a designer, you might not be a developer, you might not identify with any of those terms. The term I've heard thrown around is builder.
Yes.
But, there are also many people who love the term designer and identify themselves as designers. And it doesn't seem like that would go away. It just seems like there's a broader set of materials, probably.
There's a broader set of materials, and there is also just a reality that because the tools are being democratized to make things, right, and break down those silos, that people can. And so in turn, we need to account for the fact that even if it's well-intended, there might be negative consequences. And so we need to account for training, people accordingly. The one big risk in this specific technology, and specifically with LLMs, is, and we've already seen that, unfortunately, it has already, led to some loss of life because of missing guardrails and oversight, that we are operating so close to the human being, to the human biochemistry, that we can influence positively and negatively, that there's a responsibility that comes with that, right? And so I think from a perspective of a team, of an organization, I think teams can get smaller, but you still want to have various perspectives and maybe even various, I don't know if we're going to have ever going to have real disciplines per se, but you want to have different perspectives of the same problem.
Are you still call yourself a designer? Like, is that a phrase that you use?
I do. Yes, I still very much so identify as a designer because I think I've not found any better way to describe what I do, especially when I look at my definition of design. I also believe that ultimately both a business and the design the designs we create and the way we apply design need to serve society, need to serve humans, and I think that's really just important to keep at the forefront in all of this, because it's a very technology first and technology focused discussion that's happening, especially in the tech industry, and everyone is really hyped about it. But no technology, no business is any good if it doesn't create value in the real world.
You mentioned like skills that are foundational, that are craft focused. You and I have talked for a while here about history, the philosophy. You're calling for a new sort of like movement and school. If you were watching this and you were trying to, you were a designer or you're a developer that's interested in design, you're like resonating with this. If you're a PM that's excited about this, what are the skills that you think people should lean into, that they should work on outside of the AI stuff? Because I think that's its own bucket.
Yeah, great question. I think the answer to that is a little bit different depending on the time scale. Short term, and that's probably the next few years still. Short term, I think actually developing a really deep understanding of the respective discipline that you're in and what makes quality is going to be highly relevant. And as an example, I see this with my students. I've seen it with early stage kind of designers and founders and builders. You get a lot of crap from these tools still, right? From these technologies back. And that is from all the way from text to images, videos, and so on and so forth. And, we talked about taste, and I think that's where the taste discussion wanted to go, but I think it's kind of misguided. I think you need to be able to critically think and assess the quality of the output of the system. And for designers, I think it means that you still need to be really good at understanding color psychology, aesthetics, composition, typography, spacing, all of that, sound, haptic, and develop a generalist understanding and what makes good quality. I think it's the same probably for developers too, and I think for PMs as well. So I think that will be highly relevant for the foreseeable short-term future.
One of our VPs of engineering, Marcel Weeks, has this definition of taste that is actually subject matter expertise. Mm-hmm. And I think that subject matter can vary broadly, whether it's the vertical, whether it's your discipline, or whether it's this particular kind of person. But I think that's his way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
And I like that, because that also, there's a ton of room in that for people who have different taste. And the magic is in sort of like connecting those pieces together.
And in fact, I think that's a real opportunity, actually, if we can widen what actually the exposure to all the, solutions and even aesthetic inspirations that we have, and deepen our understanding, then we can make even better discernment of, what we're getting. We can potentially even instruct the systems better in giving us something that we think should exist.
Oh, absolutely. When you watch like an excellent designer prompt these systems, their behaviors are really different than when you watch somebody who is not. They just ask for really different things, and the systems come back. So the question I have though is, can you develop this just by sort of like using AI, using LLMs, using the tools, or do you have to go do it yourself? Almost by hand, like, is part of the learning actually doing it the harder way, and to really engage with the material?
Yes, absolutely. And I don't want to sound, too nostalgic. But, with every level of mastery, I think you don't get around just doing it the hard way and really learning the intricacies of whatever it is that you're learning. So if you want to be able to judge great typography, you need to go down the rabbit hole of understanding not just intellectually, but you need to understand also how do you apply it, right? Like how do you combine typefaces? What makes a good typeface? What makes a readable typeface, right? What makes an aesthetically pleasing one that you can use on a poster but not in a UI? Just this morning I had a session with students that auto-generated, a color palette for a UI with GPT, and it was horrendous. And GPT gave this expansive explanation of why these would be the perfect colors. And so being able to step back and understanding the color psychology, understanding, for example, what wavelength does in terms of how we perceive intensity, how, the cultural context of certain colors, if you want to release something in China, you understand the cultural context versus when you release something in the US only, and so on and so forth. I think it's good explanation of why a lot of these skills will still be highly relevant, even if not more, right? Because these systems will just throw stuff at us. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's a really awarded fashion photographer, and early on, him and I were playing with like the early mid journeys, and my God, I mean, the stuff was on the one hand really impressive, but it was also horrendous because it didn't tell a story and it didn't have an emotional connection. And composition was very boring and not exciting, and it didn't have like the edge that you're looking for when you do certain fashion photography.
I love that your examples were like topography, color, fashion photography, and we could go down the list to motion, to haptics, to information architecture, to every one of these is extremely deep, and you get something back always.
Yeah.
But you need to know if it is good and if it's good enough. And if the tools are helping you towards sort of like good enough, they're helping everybody else towards good enough too. Right. And then everything kind of looks the same at this average level. You don't necessarily stand out. And then you're sort of left with a hello, cursive hello, but it's the second, third, millionth one. It's not nearly as exciting as the first one.
Exactly. And I mean, at this point, a good example here is how many LinkedIn posts have you read in the last 3 months that start with, and here's the crazy part, or the result ? Because all of this stuff is just, and I posted this like 6 months ago, I already reached GPT fatigue when it comes to just reading the stuff that people put into these, get out of these systems and then just put them on the internet, which, by the way, is actually something that we don't want to just joke about, because the mass production and pollution of the digital world is way underway. I think it's just crossed the chasm of there's more artificially generated content on the internet than there's human created content on the internet, which is fascinating and not dissimilar to the pollution that we've reached in terms of mass production of stuff since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So it's something for us to be mindful about as designers as well, and as product makers, of the trade-offs. And again, I think what can help there is develop the critical thinking skills in your various disciplines while you become more and more a generalist product builder, of discerning what is of quality and what do you want to actually put in front of people. Because I think as good product makers, there's an imperative there morally, but also, as you said earlier, from a business perspective, if everyone can just produce the same sort of mediocre outcome with the push of a button, then the things that you do on top of that play a huge role, even more so than ever, probably, to make a customer choose you over someone else and stick with you maybe over someone else.
Or make an employee feel confident in the decisions they're making, or make them feel sure that they've completed the task, or any number of other examples like that. I think that's a really good case for like the craft in all of these different sort of areas really being important, but also making it more important to be able to articulate why they matter, when people can push a button and see a thing that looks kind of like that, sort of a facsimile of that, but it seems like a tremendous opportunity to differentiate as a candidate, as a potential employee, and as a company. And then, I think this framing of AI as normal technology also gives us a second to consider where we are at this moment. And I would just encourage everybody watching this to give that a read and think about it, because it kind of reframes the weekly sort of grind, the weekly sort of news cycle that ends up happening.
Yeah, exactly. And there's plenty of other really good books and research out there too that makes this paper not even stand on its own. And I think especially for product makers of all kinds, it is important to keep exactly that perspective and say, okay, technology for technology's sake is not useful, right? It is the job of designers, and I'm saying this now in the broader sense, not in the sense of the people that the product builders, the makers, is to make something useful out of that technology. And as long as people are the ones that are consuming this, and we're designing for us as society and as people, that's the more important differentiator. And so putting that into perspective and seeing that this new general purpose technology will give us the opportunity to really find, make existing use cases even better, more intuitive, more human, more useful, more valuable, maybe even allow us to solve problems we weren't able to solve if we make the technology approachable and start changing behaviors for the better. I think that's the real opportunity. It's not the kind of staying in the hamster wheel and just kind of cranking out stuff that we haven't even tested or tried, or and it's tricky. I mean, I've been in the big tech world specifically, and even in startups where you're always against the clock. But I think your point is probably very critical here, that everyone will be able to do the easy stuff very, very quickly at the same more or less level of quality. So if you really want to have long-term sustainable success, then that requires more work, more perspective, and so on and so forth. And it also gives us a chance to also look for the unintended consequences, which come with every general purpose technology. It's not just an AI thing, and I'm not a doomer, but there are unintended consequences that come with this technology because we're close to the human. They're grave sometimes, right? And we need to mitigate those too. And just finding a little bit more balance, I think, will be helpful.
Thank you, Ben. Incredible to talk. Thanks for sharing that article with me, which kicked this off. I hope it's helpful for other people and they find it interesting. And Poets and Thinkers, you're also a great follow on LinkedIn. It sounds like you do not use AI to generate your posts. Maybe there's some assistance in there.
I do use AI to help in all sorts of ways with writing and editing, and even going through research. But again, I think it's the discernment that makes right. The difference. But I appreciate the plug. I also really appreciate it. We had a discussion and really fruitful exchange leading up to this, which I really appreciated, Andrew. So thank you for having me.